Welcome to Learnin Bourbon, the educational class for bourbon geeks. My name is McNew. Please join me in welcoming my co-host Steve Akeley, along with our special guest Alan Bishop from Spirits of French Lick.
Hey, Alan, how you doing, man?
Good, buddy. How you doing?
I'm doing real well. We're excited to have you here today, man.
Yeah, I'm excited to be a part of this. I think it's a fun format. So,
Yes, yeah, it's a good thing. And you sat in last week, so you have been exposed to this before. You watched the Freddie one with us.
yeah. That was a great one too. There was a lot of neat stuff came out of that, especially when Stumpy called in. That was a great question.
That led into conversation even the next day, and I don't know that we have that resolved. That's a total TTB thing. So, yeah,
Right.
I don't know what they would.
They probably don't know the answer to that question.
They probably don't either. Someone just needs to test it and see what happens. So,
Right.
here's what I guess what would happen. It would go through, get approved, it would hit the shelf, and then someone would complain, and then they would be like, "Hey, you got to pull that off the shelf. That's against the rules." The TTB has been known to do that before.
Yeah, I would even say that probably what would happen is that if you applied for that 3 different times through the TTB, you would probably get an acceptance from 2 and an acceptance from 1. So
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of rules, and so it's not an easy gig for sure. So we're not making fun of them. So we're here today to talk about the versatility of a pot still. We know, Alan, you love a pot still. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. What's the value to it? What's the difference? Why you love it so much? All those kind of things. But I think we literally need to start at ground zero with this conversation. What exactly is a pot still?
it's a very good question. So the simple and short version of that, I'll keep that as short as I can because I can ramble on about this forever, is that a pot still is really the oldest form of distillation for potable spirits. There is a version of distillation that does predate that for potable spirits called an aquatar, which is basically a different variation on a pot still. But a pot still at its base, and I've got all kinds of stuff here I could show you guys as well. Let me know if you can see that.
Okay.
So a little miniature pot still. So basic boiler, an alembic head or an onion head. Some people call it an onion head, line arm, and then condenser, whatever style of condenser you're going to use. It's a very basic concept. It goes back to the alchemists. It actually goes back before that. You can trace the pot still back to about the 3rd century BC in China, but it really becomes a big deal with the alchemists in the middle 1400s or so. Those are the guys that are really popularizing using the pot still, and out of that kind of grows beverage alcohol. A little bit before that, they're using it more for making essential oils and things of that nature, as well as sacramentally the Dionysian culture using pot stills for various sacramental rites and things of that nature. But basically, a simple pot is a boiler to boil your wine or your beer in, with a head to capture the vapor, a line arm to take it over to your condenser, and a condenser underneath cold water to condense the vapor back down into a liquid. And that's a basic pot still.
Okay. That little one you had there, does that just feed into your coffee pot?
It does.
Yeah,
it
that's
does,
what I figured. That's what I figured.
For an Irish coffee every morning.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're focusing on pot still today. That's the bulk of our conversation. But we'd be remiss if we didn't touch on column stills and talk about why someone who has a column still and only lives in that world would tell you that's why they do it.
Right. Yeah, for sure. There's the column still became a thing, kind of mid 1800s, a little bigger in the later 1800s. Sort of a product of industrialization, and column stills make great products. I mean, I'm not ever going to sit here and tell you that any of the big distilleries in Kentucky don't make great product. They obviously do, and they obviously have a long track record of that. And the basic reason for the switch over from, the pot still, even in the bourbon world, bourbon was born on a pot still, over to the column still is because of the industrialization factor. So pot stills are limited by batch size. So if your pot still is, say, 1,200 gallons, all you're going to be able to run in an 8 to 12 hour period is 1,200 gallons of mash, versus an industrial column still, which is fed live steam all the time, and it's just pounding that mash or that wine as it comes through. And that wine or that mash might only be in contact with heat for 2 minutes. Those guys can run 200 and 250 gallons of mash a minute through a column still, keep consistency all the time, have the same product day in, day out, night in, night out, across shifts, etc., because everything's tuned in so tight. It's a much more industrial efficient way to make a lot of alcohol at one time, versus a batch system, which is a little more problematic, especially if you don't have a good trained distiller that understands how to make cuts on a pot still, etc. So it's pretty easy to see why the big guys definitely switched over to the column still technology, especially the low rectification column stills, Kentucky beer stills that you're seeing in Kentucky, etc. They're just good, reliable pieces of equipment that do exactly what they need to do day in and day out and make the same product day in and day out.
Yeah. I think it would help us a little bit to kind of guide this discussion as to exactly what the equivalent on a pot still is. And I'm going to use two examples where people that are on this call probably have seen the equipment in these distilleries. So Royce Neely's place, he's got a 600-gallon pot still. And if you look at New Riff, they have a 36-inch column still. So if both of those wanted to run full time, so if New Riff was running that 36-inch column still 24 hours a day, how many pot stills would Royce Neely need to pump out the same amount of whiskey? Now, approximately. We're not gonna hold you to an exact number here, but
I'm just gonna take a shot in the dark because I don't have the math. I'm not gonna sit down and do the math at the moment, but we're gonna say that he's gonna need upwards of about 20 or so to keep up, even close, anywhere near what they would do off of that column still, for sure.
Yeah. So that helps the audience really get an idea of exactly what I think is the number one reason why you're using a column still. If you're using it, is just for comparison. I mean, Royce Neely, he can't fit 20 pot stills in the place he's at now. I mean, he would have to have a huge facility, and obviously it's a tedious process. We'll get into all that, and it would be a challenge. It'd be a totally different deal than he's got right now, for sure.
It's one of the same reasons why in Scotland you see all the single malt producers, selling a lot of their stuff for blends. Those blends are the industrial commodity whiskey of Scotland. And the reason that exists is because that's the only way they can get enough mass to produce a product like that is by having, all these different pot still distilleries come together and blend their product together to get that volume.
Okay. That kind of sets the stage of, the benefits of column still and all that. But now we really want to focus on that. McNew, I'll turn it over to you to kind of where we start getting into some of these things now that's more Alan's wheelhouse. We're talking about the good side of the pot still and the things he loves about it.
All right, so let's just jump in and tell us about the benefits of a pot still.
So with the benefits of a pot still, I'm going to start here with an analogy that I always do on tour, and this ties back into the column still, because this is a basic understanding that I like to use to get that conversation started. So think of a pot still and a column still both as being, let's imagine they're both guitars. A column still is very much an electric guitar. A pot still is very much an acoustic guitar. They're both making music. They're just using very different methodology to get to the end point. It's much easier to cover up a mistake on a column still because of the mass that you're dealing with versus a pot still. If you make a mistake on a pot still, somebody's going to notice it without a doubt. A pot still is a little bit more rhythmic. It's a little bit more reflective than a column still. It definitely involves the producer a lot more. It's very reflective of both its environment and the person running the pot still. So a pot still is a very inefficient piece of technology. You are distilling nearly as much water as you are ethanol when you're running a pot still, which is a good thing and a bad thing. The water is actually what's carrying the flavor and the aroma. Ethanol itself actually carries no flavor or aroma. Those inefficiencies are what give pot still distillation its particular mouthfeel, its aroma, its taste, its roundness, etc. What we like to call pot still funk. Somebody put that in one of our reviews, and we just kind of stuck with it. I love it. I think it's awesome. It sort of defines what we do. Pot stills are very much reflective, again, of the environment that they're in. So everything in the world affects a pot still. At Spirits of French Lick, if we're running a whiskey in the wintertime and we run that same whiskey in the summertime, they both make slightly different products. And the reason for that is because in the wintertime, it's a little colder in there. So we get a little bit of natural reflux, which is basically condensation on the head of the pot still from the cold weather, because it takes longer for the top of this pot to heat up. It's harder to maintain that temperature. So we're actually condensing alcohol back down into liquid in the pot, drops back into the pot, drops through vapor alcohol, proof and purity rises. So you don't really create consistency on a pot still. You manage it over time by blending your different stocks together. A good example of that is with, say, something like Lee Sinclair. If I come in on a Monday and I'm in a good mood, because, again, a pot still is very reflective of the person running it, I'm going to make a certain style of whiskey. If I come in on a Wednesday and I'm in a bad mood, I'm going to make a slightly different style of whiskey. Doesn't mean that either one of those two whiskeys is bad. It means that they're slightly different from one another. But that gives us opportunity to find unique profiles, blend those unique profiles together, really create some character in the bottle and in the bottling that we're doing, and then also have the opportunity for a lot of single barrels. We're making about 4 barrels a day off of our pot stills. The fun thing about it is that you can come into my distillery. We barrel each one of those batches every single day. So if we have Lee Sinclair, you might have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday batches, just 4 barrels each. All 4 of them are going to be different white spirits off the pot still slightly because of variations in temperature, etc., and then also differentiated by the wood. So there's a lot more chance for variation in pot still distillation. And that's what I'm really in love with as a distiller. If I were in, and again, not knocking any of the big column still distilleries, but if I were in a, column still distillery, I would probably be the most boring, miserable person on the face of the planet, because I can't wrap my head around doing the same thing every day just based on a checklist versus, looking at, let's say, the weather coming in and going, hey, there's a storm front coming in, because barometric pressure affects pot still distillation as well. You have a storm front come in, the still kind of slows down. It's kind of like putting the brakes on. Those little fun variations, those inefficiencies, and the ability to adapt to those inefficiencies on the fly and pull out the best possible product that you can is what makes it fun for me. It's also what makes the product a lot more dynamic, in my opinion, than off of a column still, and the ability to make unique individual cuts, which you don't have off of a low rectification column still.
All right, so people like you that love a pot still love that flexibility. Some people that don't love it would say it's inefficient. So if we were to pull a sample in the middle of a run, is it a better flavor in the hearts?
That's a very good question. So it kind of depends on, a lot of different variations. I wouldn't say that it's better. I would say that a pot still is certainly much, much cleaner, because you're actually capable of making cuts off of a pot still versus a low rectification column still. So one of the issues with a low rectification column still is that it's feeding so much mash, so much material at one time, and trying to fly through it so quickly that you don't really have the ability to make a proper heads cut. Now, you can run your condenser a little warmer and you can vaporize some of that stuff out to the atmosphere, but with a true pot still, you're actually able to cut out different fractions of alcohol. Now, there are exceptions to that. Adam Stump has a really good exception to it, something very similar to a coffee still. Almost even a hybrid between a coffee still and a pot still. So there are subtle little exceptions to that rule, obviously. But it's really personal preference. It's what do you like? So I grew up in a family of distillers, and all we ever ran was pot stills. So my love for pot still whiskey runs pretty deeply in my blood, just like it does a lot of other, moonshining families, etc. It's the taste that I'm familiar with, and it's something that I think you either understand that whiskey used to taste that way and can still taste that way, or you may honestly never get it. I mean, it's kind of that much of a dynamic.
All right. So what's running a pot still like? Run us through your day when you operate one.
Gotcha. So we typically what we do is we're on a 3 to 5 day fermentation period. And we do double pot still distillation of spirits especially. So what we're doing is we're going to take our beer or water, we're going to place it into our stripping still, pot still distillation, double pot still distillation. Two separate distillations. The first, called a stripping run. The entirety of the stripping run is based on essentially just all of the alcohol in the beer that you can. If you think of all the alcohol in the beer being on a curve, all you're doing is trying to take all that off. You're not doing anything to change it. You're just evaporating and condensing it, and a little bit of chemical breakdown throughout that process. So we'll go into the 1,200 gallon stripping still. That's going to run for roughly 8 to 12 hours, depending on what we're running at the time. We're going to come off at about 60 proof. We're going to collect all that and go back into a secondary pot still, redistill it, and we're going to make 4 cuts. So on a pot still, you have 4 fractions of alcohol separated at different points based on temperature. The very first fraction, the first couple gallons that come off a pot still, say 350 gallons, are going to be 4 shots, almost pure methanol, the stuff you hear about moonshiners drinking and going blind, etc. Once you imbibe methanol, it basically turns into formic acid, and formaldehyde in your liver, you can't get it back out. We collect all that. We either toss it, we use clean stainless up around the building, or I take it home and start fires with it. I'm not entirely sure the legalities of that, but it is what it is. Then we have our heads, which is acetaldehyde, ethyl acetate. This is all determined by sensory analysis, basically. So acetaldehyde, ethyl acetate.
Someone's door's open.
Right?
It's Kent.
Oh, Kent, yes. Oh, he's in. Yeah, that was in the car. So yeah.
I am in the car. Hey, mute me. How do I mute this?
Hit the microphone button. It looks like an oval with a little stand underneath it. I don't know how to mute you myself.
So the next piece that comes off is acetaldehyde ethyl acetate. Basically smells like fingernail polish remover. You can reuse it. You can put it back into your stripping run and pull all the good alcohol back out because acetaldehyde and ethyl acetate don't build up over time. They break down with heat during the distilling process. Or sometimes we actually feed that back to the fermenters because the yeast will also eat those two compounds as well. After that, you have the hearts, which is your potable alcohol. For us, that runs about 158 proof, down to somewhere between, let's say, 88 and 95, depending on what we're doing. If we're going to run a clear spirit, we don't want any heads. We don't want any tails. If we're going to run a brown spirit like bourbon, we want just a little bit of heads and a little bit of tails, because those compounds, that even though they don't taste great in a light spirit, they will esterify over time in the barrel and become taste phenolics and esters that you want. And then from there down to 20 is what we call tails, where you have more water than you do ethanol. Again, the water is what's carrying the flavor. So even though the tails smell slightly vegetative, kind of like boiled squash, it's actually where most of your flavor and consistency is over time. So we'll reuse those tails. If we're going to run a product 40 times in one season, we're going to reuse those tails in the doubling runs all 40 times. The heads, on the other hand, we'll reuse those for whiskey about 5 times and then dump and start over. And then on brandy, we never reuse the heads whatsoever.
Okay. I've got a question for you. Does a false pot still valor anger you? What I mean by that, I mean, there's a couple examples I can think of right away that are well known in the industry, and there's probably tons of them. But there's one big distillery that is well known, and probably a lot of people have toured that. You go into this one part of the tour, and there's 3 huge pot stills there, and they never say that that's all that their whiskey is distilled on, but they never don't say that either. They don't say it's a blend of things made on a column and some of the pot stills. So you just assume when you see that's how they're making all that whiskey. And another one, there's a whole brand that's built around that. Again, another well-known distillery, a whole, brand around, it's a pot still whiskey and all that. And, you see a pot still when you go there, but it's a source product. And I don't know whether the source product is made on a pot still or not. Does that kind of stuff bother you? Because it feels like they're cashing in on the things that you're actually doing. Not you personally, or not Spirits of French Lick, but just the pot still in general.
That stuff does piss me off quite a bit. Now, the one with the 3 pot stills doesn't make me as mad because, like you said, they've never denied, but they don't also say explicitly. The ones that I find more annoying are the ones who either don't do the whole process themselves. In other words, they don't do any fermentation. They buy low wine. Maybe they run it through a pot still. Maybe they make cuts. Maybe they don't. Or the ones that we all know are cheating. This is more common with a particular white, tasteless, odorless product and a specific company. Where it is with bourbon, where but all they're really doing is backing the damn truck up, hooking a hose up to the still, putting a hose on the output of the still, and it's literally just running through a pot still. That's not pot still distillation. It does piss me off because this is one of those things that pot still distillation, in my opinion, if you're going to do it, then you're going to do it. All right. But the truth of the matter is it's not something that you can just go to school and learn. It's very much like the equivalent of Cooper and barrels, right? You really need to spend years studying pot still distillation to have some idea of how it really works. And I run into this on a daily basis where, I'll say something affects pot still distillation. People look at me like I'm crazy as hell, but I'm confident saying the things I do about pot still distillation because I started doing this when I was 15. I'm 35 now. I've damn sure run my share of it. I know about 3,000 ways not to make whiskey at this point. So not to say that my one way is the right way to do it, because there's a lot of different ways to do it. But it comes off obviously as inauthentic. And then when I see marketing like that, like what the big word now is triggered, right? So, and I'm not getting into all that stuff, but if anything were to trigger me, it is that bullshit. Exactly. All that marketing bullshit about pot stills and, guys that aren't really running them, and most distillers, not knocking most big commercial distillers, but a lot of big commercial distillers you couldn't take and put in front of a pot still and expect them to make a great product because it's a little different than running a column still. and you either get it or you don't. And sometimes it takes years to get it. Every day I learn something new about it. And for me, it's the single most humbling art out there. You can come in on Monday and think, I've got this under control and I know what I'm doing at 7 o'clock in the morning. And by 10 o'clock in the morning, you'd be like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing or why anybody gave me keys to a distillery. So,
yeah. Alan, another question. When I went to Philadelphia a few years back, and we went to Independence Hall, and there's a couple different ways you could look at that experience, because in reality, of course, those people that were there and presided and all the great things that happened in the country, they're long gone, and it's really just a room filled with old desks and old furniture, and you could easily write that off as it's no different than going to an old antique store, or you can embrace what's going on there, and you can be like, wow, this is the start. This is the ground zero for this country. This is where all the things happen. And while it may be imperfect, this is the greatest country in the world. And it all started right here, writing documents, voting on things, talking about things, discussing things. And it can be very powerful. Is a pot still kind of the same way with you? It's a connection to the past and the fact that, immigrants that came to this country with a pot still, strapped to their back, and they're on a horseback and they're riding across the country and establishing homesteads, and then they begin distilling, and it becomes a way of life for people. Is that play into this at all for you?
I think in a very big way it does, and that probably has a lot to do with growing up around it, obviously. For me, when I was a kid, I probably looked at a pot still the same way that, a farmer in the 1800s did. It wasn't anything romantic that you wrote a story about. It was a piece of farm equipment. Now, my opinion on that has changed, but the larger picture there is not only is it an antique thing that ties back to heritage, but you have to imagine that at some point in time, once industrialization happens, once column still distillation becomes a thing, how much got left behind? I don't think we were quite at the forte of pot still distillation when that happened. I don't think anybody's been to the top of that mountain yet. And I think there's a lot more there to find and a lot more there to explore, whether that's on more of the mysticism sort of side of things, the fluffy rainbow lover unicorn sort of side of things, or if that's on the more hardcore scientific side of things. I tend to like to think that I sort of straddle both those lines when it comes to my research on pot still distillation. But certainly I think that there were varieties of bourbon in particular that were made on pot stills that didn't make the transition over to column stills because they didn't lend themselves to that style of industrialized distillation. So you're currently seeing a big return to interest in oats as an example. And one of the reasons that oats went away is because they do not distill well on a column still for two reasons. A, they're sticky, and B, you're not in contact with heat long enough to actually break down the long chain fatty acids into esters and phenols or the finished flavors that you're actually going to enjoy. So pot still distillers are going back and we're going, hey, somewhere back there, we lost this. This is something that we can bring back. It's something different. It's new to us, but it's really nothing new under the sun. This was done in the 1800s. I also think that pot stills very much are a reflection of, let's say, a regional food shed. So the local craft and artisan distilling movement is very much based on the locavore movement. It's based on local food sheds, farmers markets, etc. That's what it sprang out of. The same with craft brewing. And so pot stills being batch still distillation, they're obviously a little more, in my opinion, I always hesitate to use the word handcrafted, but the distilling methodology is a little bit more hands-on than a column still distillation is, and maybe a little bit more personalized because you may only have one or two people running a pot still in a distillery versus a whole team of distillers running the distilling floor at a big distillery. And it's sort of the same thing as going and buying, your homegrown tomatoes from your local farmer, right? So you get to meet the guy, you get to talk to the guy, and the guy's very much hands-on in this thing, and he's there with those plants, every day, day in, day out. Same thing with a pot still, right? And I think that's what really intrigues me in a lot of ways as well. Also, the fact that a pot still is so much more versatile than people give it credit for. As I mentioned earlier on, at its base, it is just a boiling pot with a head, a line arm, and a condenser. But there's a lot of other neat things that you can do with them. You can run deflamators on them, which raise your proof and your purity on purpose, make lighter-styled whiskeys. They do that a lot in Scotland. You don't really see that here in bourbon country and typically, but I think there are distillers that are sort of exploring that. You can do single pass distillations, which are extremely low proof, but need a little bit of extra aging to them. You can change up your flavor profile by whether or not you're using a worm or a shotgun condenser, etc. You can change up your flavor profile by using a thump barrel. And then that thumb barrel, you can run flavors as well. And it's still, as long as it's, within the realm of what bourbon is composed of, if you throw some corn in the thumb barrel, that's going to raise the flavor of that corn in the profile, etc. So there's a lot more versatility that's not yet been explored, or is just now barely being explored. And it's a lot more diverse in pot still distillation than it is in column still distillation, because really in column still distillation, it's always, because of the way that it's set up, going to be about the way they fermented, the yeast that they use, the grains they use, and then after that, it's barrel placement, right? It's wherever the barrel was in the warehouse, what the temperature was in the warehouse, etc. So I like having a lot more variables in that.
Yeah. Last question I've got for you, and this is kind of just a dream thing. You got to play along a little bit with this one. But if the owner of your company, we're not going to say you, because if you'd probably just retire and make whiskey for yourself. But if the owner of your company hit a $500 million lottery, and I've seen some business plans where a nationwide distillery, if you're opening up from day one, it's going to cost about $30 million. And again, you're not nationwide the moment you open the door, but you're positioning yourself for 2 to 4 years. You're going to be able to get it. You can open up a distillery for a lot less than that, but you're going to start very small. You're going to service a local market. You may grow eventually to be a nationwide provider. But if you want to kind of get out of the gate, I'm saying it's going to be $30 million. So if your owner came to you and said, Alan, you know what? I won this $500 million lottery. I kind of want to stay in the business. I love what you're doing. Let's be a big player though. Let's get a nationwide distillery. And I want to turn it over to you though. You're the guy. What would you design this distillery to look like? What would be, how many pot stills? What would the size of the pot stills look like? What would this place look like? Or would you just sell your soul and also I'd see a column still in there?
You said he got the money, not me, right?
Yeah. Because if I know we'd never. You wouldn't return my phone calls anymore. That'd be the end of Steve Akeley and Alan Bishop. That'd be it.
Right. Just sign off. Just ace it. Yeah. If that were me in that situation, I would certainly turn to Scotland and see how a lot of the single malt producers have handled that situation, because at this point, where we're at in our country, we've not seen that happen with pot still distillation yet. Mm-hmm. But certainly Scotland deals with that on a yearly basis. Scotch whiskey's a huge category, obviously, and those guys are all doing pot still distillation. So the truth of the matter is I'm going to drop in as many pot stills as I can purchase of the smallest size that I think is practical. So let's say 350 gallons for our doubling stills, 1,200 gallons for our stripping stills. And I'm going to up the ante by running all of those stills on 2 shifts is what I'm going to do. And I'm going to have to spend some time training some distillers, because there's no way that one guy is going to do that, right?
Right.
But that's what you'll see. If you go somewhere like, let's say, in Cognac, France, you'll see 2 lines of pot stills just in rows, and every pot still has a distiller assigned to it, and all those distillers have got
that's cool
years on the column.
Yeah.
So that's where we would head with that, more than likely, to really train those guys and get them where they needed to be, because it's not just the equipment itself; it's the knowledge to know how to run the equipment. So, yeah.
All right. Well, it's Q&A time. Let's open up the phone lines here. If you have a question, please text me, Steve Akeley, and we will get you in the question queue, and I'll tell you to open up your line. We're going to start out with the guy who always seems to go first. Winston, you're up first.
Sorry, I like asking questions. So I just recently started distilling at home, and I bought a vacuum still, and I know that's not the topic tonight, but have you done any research on those, and what do you think about vacuum stills versus pot stills?
I actually have done a little bit of research on vacuums, and I think vacuums are really cool, especially if your interest, your study interest, is going to be things like extraction, or if you're interested at all in essential oils and or CBD extraction. I think that's really where that game's to be played at. If you want to make really purified alcohols as bases for your gin or your aquavit, absinthe, etc., that's certainly worthwhile. It's also a pretty in-depth subject. So if you're starting off there, a pot still should be fairly easy for you to get into a little bit further down the road, without a doubt. So they're very much worthwhile to play with. It's another tool in the distiller's toolbox, and that's all these things all are tools.
Absolutely. All right. Anybody else have a question? Please text me. Oh, here comes in one right now. Kevin, you're up.
Hi, Alan. Thanks for being with us tonight.
What's up, buddy?
Hey, man. With the craft, if you will, of pot still distillation, what's being done to make sure that this gets passed along, this art of pot still distillation, gets passed along to the next generation, if you will? Is that a reasonable question?
That's a very reasonable question because, again, it takes a lot of study to get to where you're going. So I'm going to speak to that in two different ways. So the first way is the way that I learned, which was I grew up around it, but when I got interested, my grandpa and my dad refused to tell me how to do anything with it. So and I don't suggest this to anybody, they gave me a 10-gallon pot still, helped me build it, and then they gave me 2 rules, which were don't blow your ass up in the backyard to bring us something once we're drinking, right? So that's the hard way. The easier way to some extent is that, yes, there is sort of a kind of an apprenticeship program, but the truth of the matter is if you really want to learn to do this, and I don't encourage anybody to break the law, it's a little easier nowadays. There are some classes you can take. You can probably get in and shadow with a distiller, et cetera, but that's not going to teach you everything you need to know. So you're going to do one of two things. You're either going to be moonshining, or you get on at a distillery. And the real way to do this, and what I would like to see happen again in this country, is that distilling used to be an apprenticeship program. You didn't get into a distillery on day one and call yourself a damn master distiller. It didn't work that way. You know, I've been in the legal industry now 6 years, and I don't call myself that, and I don't have plans to do it anytime soon because I'm always still learning. But you really need to get in somewhere, and we've done this with one of our guys at work, Stephen McNeely. He's my assistant distiller now. He spent 3 years doing nothing but mopping floors, sweeping, cleaning the bathroom, and then learning to mash from start to finish. And I guarantee you right now, he could write out a mash bill in his sleep if he had to, because he understands that. Then he went up to, having the responsibility of taking care of the boiler, etc. So the next step now is to get him onto the pot stills and show him how those cuts are made, why they're made that way, etc. But overall, unfortunately, in this country, there is not, some overarching program to be able to teach people how to run pot still distillation. And unfortunately, for those of us who would like to be educators a little bit more, it's not exactly legal for us to, set up shop in our backyard and start bringing in people to show them how to do this stuff. Certainly they make things much easier, I think. But, until somebody really gets practical hands-on experience with it, how are they going to know that this is something they love or not? I can tell you the first time that I ever did it, I was in love with it. I've been in love with it ever since then. But you got to get somebody to that initial point first. A lot of people don't even know that that's an option.
Yeah. All right. No questions in the queue. We'll give everybody a couple seconds here to, if they want a question, that'll be your last chance.
Steve, I've got one more if you want it.
Shit yet. I'm waiting on that.
What was that, Alan? Sorry.
Nobody's called me out on the lunar phase affecting pot still distillation.
It's crazy, right? Go ahead, Kevin. Kevin, did you have another one?
I did, if you don't mind. Alan, in terms of compare and contrast pot still versus column still, the reliance on the grain for flavor versus the barrel for flavor, can you talk about the differences there, if there are any?
Yeah, definitely. So for me, a pot still is very much an agricultural, alchemical sort of thing, right? So it's not just a tool for creating ethyl alcohol. It's kind of a rectification chamber in itself for being able to hold on to terroir. For me, if you want to really create or pull terroir from raw grain, pot stills are the way to do it because of the inefficiencies. Not to say that you can't do that with a column still, but I don't think it works the same way because the material is just not in contact with heat for long enough to do what it needs to really do to break down those flavors and pull them out in the way that you would want to do that with terroir. But definitely, in my opinion, pot stills are much more an agricultural farming tool, really adept at pulling out unique grain bills. I tend to approach pot still distillation a lot more like a brandy producer would. So again, it's a tool of retention and concentration. It's all about retaining and concentrating those flavors and aromas of the raw material as it was out in the field. And then sort of using those as a way to, when someone opens a bottle of your product, bring a person back to a place in time, right? So sensory analysis is closely related to memory function. And if you can have somebody have a moment where they open a bottle up and they go, oh, this reminds me of something that I remember from being a kid or someplace I've been, etc. To me, that's the coolest thing in the world as far as I'm concerned. So for me, it's much more, as opposed to in Kentucky, the big guys are going to tell you 60, 70% of their flavors come from the barrel. For me, it's more 50-50. It's 50% raw material with fermentation and distillation, and then 50% maturation after that. And I really need that blend and balance to do what I want to do as a distiller, basically.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks, Kevin. We will wrap this one up with a comment from Winston. Winston, you said you got something else. What do you got, man?
So I actually had a comment and a question. The question came out of what you just said. So I'll do the comment first. With your saying about education and the apprenticeship thing, I really love that. I did the one-day distillation class at Moonshine University, and that was fascinating, but it was only a brief peek into it. So being able to do an apprenticeship like that would be an amazing opportunity, at least in my opinion. And in terms of the question, I know someone who went up and tried your brandy and loved it, and talked about how you kept the apples in the still while you were distilling. Do you do the same thing with your grains, or do you filter out there, or is there a reason to do one or the other for different types of producing?
There is. So we do leave the grain in the still in all the bourbons that we make and all the whiskeys that we make. I'm a very big proponent of that when you have the capability of doing that. Now, not all pot stills have that capability. For example, if you see an old Appalachian style pot still with the straight sides, like what you'll see on the TV show Moonshiners, unless that's got some kind of agitation on it, you're not going to run grains in there because you can't. And that's traditionally why Scotch whiskey is run just as a wash as opposed to a mash, so you avoid burning and scorching. But really, for me, with bourbon, to really get the flavor of bourbon, you have to run the grain and all. Get as much extraction as you can out of that grain. The grain is the component that makes one of the major components that makes bourbon what it is, in my opinion. And again, it goes back to that blend and balance. So if I'm going to say that my whiskey has, if I'm making a wheated whiskey, I want you to be able to taste that wheat in there. And one of the only ways I'm going to be able to do that is by extracting as much of that wheat flavor as what I possibly can into the product to get it where it needs to go. And I think sometimes with industrial distillation, there are products that I have that I like, but I do think that you lose some of those very interesting characteristics of the grain itself in favor of the wood, which just sort of overruns a lot of those things. And you're not necessarily able to pick out those unique individual flavors.
Believe it or not, McNew says she has a question.
Uh-oh.
I do. So you just briefly mentioned nobody called you out on lunar phases. So I want to. Is there like a certain mash bill you'll distill like in a new moon versus a full moon? So tell us a little bit about that.
Wow. So I went into this thinking that we would have a very aggressive audience, so I was waiting for somebody that had done their homework to be like, this guy's full of shit and I'm going to prove it tonight. So that's what I'm doing. So I don't get that far into it. It just kind of is what it is. But I mentioned barometric pressure earlier. I mentioned the mood of the distiller, temperature, etc. But one thing that I've tracked for years and years and years, basically since I was 15 years old, along with barometric pressure, etc., is moon phases. Lunar phases. So a pot still is basically a tool of an alchemist, and all the alchemists were really trying to do was to recreate outside atmospheric conditions of evaporation and condensation. So with that, it being a tool of nature, again, everything in the world affecting a pot still, lunar phases definitely do have some small interaction with pot stills, to the extent that just as they affect every standing body of water on the face of the planet, high tide, low tide, etc., they affect creeks. If you're in law enforcement or you're in the medical profession, you know that humans are 90+% water. They definitely affect humans. They certainly affect the speed of distillation. So a pot still will run slightly faster in a full moon than it will in a new moon. And it took me years to actually figure that out and prove it. I haven't proven it to anybody else, but prove it to myself, because causation and correlation are not necessarily one and the same. But I've got several years worth of records I can look at, and I can see a noticeable difference as well. Throughout those distillations, especially one time I had a run of absinthe that should have ran for about 8.5 hours. And it was during a full moon. It was a super moon, all things being the same, running off a steam boiler.
Uh-huh.
All the same running off a steam boiler. I had that thing turned all the way down. I had the steam at the still turned all the way down, I had the boiler turned all the way down, and I could not keep up with this thing. It ran that batch of absinthe off in 4.5 hours, which is really what got me interested in that and being able to really track it, eventually graph it out so people aren't like, listen to this fucking loony bastard.
That's the kind of stuff you got to love about Alan Bishop. So, yeah. All right, my friend. Well, thanks for joining us. I think it was a very insightful conversation. I think it helps out a little bit with those that are wondering what's the difference between a pot still and a column still. We know that there's a couple different styles, and why do distilleries choose one over the other? So you certainly helped us out with that today, man.
Good.
Thanks.
Glad to be a part of it.
Thanks, buddy.
Thanks, Alan.
All right.